I looked my daughter dead in the eye and told her I couldn't babysit the kids this Sunday. My voice was shaky, my chest tight with grief, as I explained that I had to attend my brother's funeral. The man who had literally saved my life was being laid to rest in the cold ground, and I needed to be there to say my final goodbye. I thought she would understand. I thought there would be a shred of basic human empathy in her eyes. Instead, my daughter Natalie just crossed her arms, stared at me with a coldness that made my blood run cold, and said, "You still have to watch them, Dad. There is no other option. We're dropping them off." I stood there in my own kitchen, completely stunned, unable to process what I was hearing. If you are just joining this story, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a story of betrayal, so calculated, so incredibly cruel, that it forced me to completely dismantle my own family. Before I go on, let me know in the comments what city you are watching from today. And if you've ever had to stand your ground against toxic family members who tried to use you, please light up that like button. The air in the kitchen grew heavy and suffocating. I looked at Natalie, trying to find a single trace of the little girl I had raised, but all I saw was a selfish stranger. My brother Bill wasn't just a sibling to me. He was the sole reason I was still drawing breath. My mind instantly flashed back to a freezing November morning in 1985. We were working on a massive high-rise construction site in downtown Chicago. I was a structural engineer. But that morning, I was down in the dirt inspecting a deep trench for the foundation. High above me, a rusted steel cable snapped. A massive, 2-ton steel beam came hurtling off the crane, heading straight for me. I didn't even hear it coming, but Bill did. Without a second of hesitation, my brother bolted across the uneven concrete, threw his body into the trench, and shoved me out of the way, taking the crushing weight of that falling steel himself. The horrific impact shattered his legs completely. He endured 12 agonizing surgeries and spent the rest of his life walking with a heavy, labored limp, leaning on a thick wooden cane. He sacrificed his body so that I could live. He lived with that silent pain every single day, without a word of complaint, all so I could come home safely and hold my little girl. And now, decades later, that same little girl was standing in front of me, callously stripping away my right to bury the honorable man who gave her a father. I asked her how she could be so heartless. I asked how she could possibly demand this of me during the darkest weekend of our lives. That's when her husband, Derek, stepped forward. Derek was a commercial real estate broker. He always wore those flashy, incredibly expensive custom suits that cost more than my first car. He always treated me like a foolish, outdated old man. He looked at me with his signature fake, patronizing smile and spoke up. "Harrison, please don't make this all about you. My firm is facing a catastrophic financial collapse. We have a make-or-break corporate merger in New York this weekend. If we don't fly out and close this deal, the company goes under permanently. We lose absolutely everything." Natalie chimed in instantly, her voice dripping with absolute venom and emotional manipulation. She stepped aggressively into my space, poking her finger into my chest. She asked if I wanted my own grandchildren to end up out on the street. She accused me of being incredibly selfish. She said, "Dad, are you really going to abandon your living grandchildren for a dead man? Do you want us to lose our beautiful home? Bill is gone. He won't even know if you're at the funeral. But Leo and Mia need you right now." The guilt trip was heavy and perfectly calculated. They were gaslighting me, twisting my deep grief into sudden guilt, They knew exactly where my weakness lay. They knew that when it came to my grandkids, I would walk through fire without a second thought. Leo was 8, a quiet, incredibly observant boy. And little Mia was 6, full of joyful energy and complete innocence. I looked past Derek and Natalie into the living room, where the 2 kids were sitting on the rug, quietly playing with their wooden toy blocks. They had absolutely no idea about the toxic poison being spewed by their parents. My heart physically ached. I felt completely cornered. Swallowing my massive grief, I squeezed my rough, calloused hands into tight fists and slowly nodded. I told them I would watch the kids. I told them to go to New York and save their company. They didn't even offer a single word of comfort. There was no thank you, no acknowledgement of my loss. Derek just checked his expensive gold watch, grabbed his heavy leather briefcase, and immediately turned toward the door. Natalie walked into the living room, gave Leo and Mia an incredibly brief, hollow hug, and told them to behave for Grandpa. Then, they walked out the front door, practically jogging down my driveway without looking back. They climbed into Derek's brand-new luxury sedan and fired up the powerful engine. I held tightly onto my grandson Leo's small hand as we walked slowly out onto the front porch. I stood there in the dead silence, watching that sleek car back out of the driveway and speed down the quiet suburban street. I felt a profound emptiness and a deep ache in my chest. I was mourning the tragic loss of my beloved brother, but at the same time, I was mourning the daughter I thought I had raised. I felt like a total failure, completely crushed under the overwhelming weight of my own family's selfish demands. But then, the quiet morning air was suddenly broken. Little Leo gave a gentle tug on the sleeve of my faded flannel shirt. I looked down at him. He was staring intently at the empty street where his parents' car had just vanished into the distance. He looked up at me with his big, innocent eyes, his little brow furrowed with genuine childhood confusion. He asked me a simple question that made the blood in my veins completely freeze. He said, "Grandpa, if Mom and Dad are going to a boring office in New York, why did they pack their snowboards and ski goggles in the trunk?" I froze. The innocent question from my 8-year-old grandson hung in the crisp morning air, heavy and sharp as broken glass. Snowboards, ski goggles. I looked down at Leo, his big eyes blinking up at me, waiting for an answer I suddenly couldn't give. My heart began to hammer violently against my ribs. A cold, sinking feeling. The kind of absolute certainty that comes only from a lifetime of trusting your gut, swept over my entire body. I managed to force a gentle smile for the little boy, telling him that sometimes grown-ups take silly things on stressful trips just to feel better. It was a terrible excuse, but it was enough to satisfy him, and he ran back inside to play with his little sister. I stood paralyzed on the wooden porch for what felt like an eternity. The silence of the neighborhood felt heavy and suffocating. I needed to know the absolute truth. I walked back inside, making sure the kids were happily occupied with their blocks in the living room. I slipped quietly into the kitchen and picked up Leo's digital tablet from the granite countertop. My daughter had installed a family tracking app on it years ago, claiming it was for keeping tabs on everyone's safety. She always bragged to her friends about how it kept our family safe and connected. With trembling fingers, I opened the app. The bright screen loaded a digital map, showing little icons for each of our devices. I zoomed in on the icon representing Derek's phone. If they were truly flying to New York for a massive, high-stakes corporate merger, they would be heading straight toward the bustling terminals of the main international airport. But the little blue dot on the screen wasn't moving in that direction. It was traveling in the exact opposite direction. I watched the digital dot slide smoothly along the interstate, pulling off the highway, heading directly toward an exclusive private airfield located in an affluent suburb of the city. I tapped on the destination details, which the app automatically predicted based on their travel history and calendar bookings. The screen cheerfully informed me that they had booked a private charter flight. The destination was a luxury ski resort in Aspen, Colorado. I stared at the bright screen until my eyes burned. The pulsing digital blue dot blinked rhythmically, as if mocking my profound grief. Aspen. They were going to Aspen. A wave of suffocating nausea rolled through my stomach, knotting my insides into a painful ball. They hadn't just lied to me. They had looked me right in the eyes, used the sacred memory of my newly deceased brother, and unashamedly guilt-tripped me. All so they could go drink expensive champagne on a snow-covered mountain. They skipped the funeral of the brave man who saved my life for a luxury vacation. The sheer cruelty of it took my breath away. They used my intense grief against me. They used my deep love for my grandkids to treat me like a convenient, free babysitter. I felt a burning anger ignite deep within my chest, a quiet, dangerous fury that I hadn't felt in decades. It was the kind of anger that makes your hands completely steady and your mind terrifyingly clear. For most of the rest of the day, I went through the motions of being a loving grandfather in a numb trance. I made them their favorite macaroni and cheese for lunch, built tall towers out of blocks, and read them adventure stories until their little eyes grew heavy. When the sun finally went down and the house was completely quiet, I knew exactly what I had to do. The boundaries of trust were officially broken. It was time to break the rules. I walked slowly down the long hallway and stood before the heavy oak door of Derek's home office. He had a strict rule that no one was ever allowed inside. I turned the cold brass knob. It was unlocked. I pushed the heavy door open, stepped inside, and clicked on the small, elegant desk lamp. The room was a monument to superficial wealth and fragile masculine ego. Everything in the office was designed to project an image of immense, unearned success. There were imported leather couches, a massive mahogany desk polished to a mirror shine, and pointlessly expensive abstract paintings. I stood there, looking at my own hands in the dim, warm light. My hands were rough, permanently scarred, and covered in thick calluses from 40 years of welding, heavy steel, and drawing architectural blueprints. I built real things. I built massive structures designed to withstand raging hurricanes and terrifying earthquakes. I worked until my back ached and my fingers bled to provide a solid, unshakable foundation for my daughter. And she had chosen a man who built nothing. A man who traded in invisible money and lived entirely on false appearances. I felt a profound sense of failure as a father. I had somehow raised a daughter who valued this empty, flashy room more than basic human decency. I began to search the room. I didn't care about privacy anymore. I sat in his plush leather chair and examined the massive mahogany desk. On the bottom right side, there was a heavy steel drawer. I tugged the handle, but it was locked tight. A keyhole sat flush against the dark wood. But I was an engineer. I had spent decades on brutal construction sites, learning how things were put together, which meant I also knew how to take them apart. I retrieved a metal tension wrench and a flat-headed pick from my toolkit. Kneeling by the desk, I slid the tools into the keyhole and applied gentle pressure. I heard a sharp, satisfying click. The lock gave way. I pulled the drawer open. Inside sat a thick, heavy folder. Printed clearly, on the front label, was my full name, followed immediately by my home address. My heart hammered against my ribs as I reached into the dark metal drawer and pulled out the heavy manila folder. The thick paper felt cold and stiff against my calloused fingertips. My full legal name, Harrison Cole, was printed in bold black ink, right on the top tab, directly above the address of the home I had lived in for over 40 years. I leaned back into Derek's incredibly soft black leather chair, placing the folder carefully on the polished mahogany desk. The quiet, smooth hum of the central air conditioning suddenly sounded like a roaring wind. I slowly flipped open the front cover. The very first document I saw was a comprehensive property appraisal report. It was printed on thick, expensive paper, complete with high-resolution color photographs of my own front yard. I stared at the glossy pictures of my home. It was a beautiful 1920s craftsman-style house, nestled on a quiet, tree-lined street in the historic heart of Chicago. I hadn't just bought that house. I had poured my actual blood, sweat, and tears into it. When my late wife and I first purchased the property, it was nothing more than a broken-down, forgotten shell. For 30 years, I painstakingly restored every single inch of it. I mixed heavy concrete with my own hands to rebuild the crumbling stone foundation. I spent scorching summer days, climbing the steep roof, hand-laying every single cedar shingle. I spent countless late nights in the garage, carefully sanding the original oak floors until they gleamed. That house wasn't just a piece of real estate. It was a living monument to my beautiful, married, Annette, and a safe haven I built for my family. Seeing it reduced to a stack of cold appraisal photos inside my fraudulent son-in-law's locked drawer made my stomach turn completely over. I flipped through the report, scanning the dense financial text. The appraiser had meticulously noted the custom woodwork I installed and the reinforced steel beams used to open up the living room. They had placed a market value of $1.8 million on my life's work. A terrifying question echoed in my mind. Why would Derek, a commercial real estate broker who dealt exclusively in high-rise office buildings, have a residential appraisal done on my completely paid-off private home without telling me? I had fully paid off my mortgage over 15 years ago, shortly after my beloved wife passed away. I did that intentionally to ensure I would never owe a single dime to any bank for the rest of my days. I wanted to leave a completely unburdened, debt-free legacy for my daughter to inherit. I turned the final page of the appraisal report, desperately hoping for a logical explanation. But what I discovered next caused the blood in my veins to turn absolutely ice cold. Attached, right behind the photographs, was a thick stack of legal banking documents bearing the official watermark of a massive national bank. The top of the first page read in bold, capital letters, Home Equity Line of Credit Agreement. My breath caught in my throat. A home equity line of credit is a tool that allows a homeowner to borrow money against the value of their house. It is, for all intents and purposes, a mortgage. I pulled a pair of wire-rimmed reading glasses from my shirt pocket, my rough hands shaking violently. I slid them onto my face, forcing my aging eyes to focus on the fine print. The document outlined a massive financial transaction. Someone had successfully applied for and been granted a massive loan using my completely paid-off, historic craftsman home as collateral. I scanned down to the center of the page, where the primary loan amount was printed in bold, undeniable ink. $600,000. The numbers blurred together as a wave of intense dizziness washed over me. $600,000. It was an astronomical, crushing amount of money. If that loan defaulted, the bank had the absolute legal right to foreclose on my property. They could take the very house I rebuilt with these hands, legally evict me, and sell it at an auction to the highest bidder. My heart raced wildly in my chest. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead. It had to be a mistake. A bank cannot simply hand over more than $500,000 and place a massive lien against a property without the explicit, legally binding authorization of the property owner. I had never spoken to a loan officer. I had never stepped foot inside that specific bank branch in my entire life. I certainly had never agreed to put my sanctuary at risk to fund whatever luxury vacation Derek and Natalie were hiding out on. I gripped the edges of the paper, my knuckles turning white with exertion. I flipped rapidly through the dense legal jargon, ignoring the complex interest rate charts and the rigid repayment schedules. I went straight to the very last page of the contract. The only page that truly mattered, the main signature page. I stared at the bottom right corner of the document, where the primary borrower was legally required to sign their name in ink. The breath left my lungs completely. There, right on the solid black line, was my name, Harrison Cole, written out perfectly. I leaned in, close, my eyes filling with horror and disbelief. It was a flawless forgery of my handwriting. The distinct sweeping loops of my cursive and the deliberate angle of my signature were replicated with terrifying precision. I ran my thumb over the ink, feeling the indentations where the pen had pressed into the paper. And right next to that perfectly forged signature, making the fraudulent loan document absolutely official and legally binding, was the raised, deep blue ink stamp of an official state-registered notary public. I stared at the signature on the final page of the loan agreement, my mind completely paralyzed by the sheer audacity of the crime before me. This wasn't just a clumsy attempt at copying. This was a highly calculated, legally binding authorization that had been stamped with the official seal of a notary. I traced the blue ink with a trembling finger, a deep, sickening dread spreading through my chest. How could a major $1,000 loan, without ever speaking to me directly, how could a professional notary legally witness a signature that I had never provided in front of them? The horrific questions spun like a violent storm in my head. I leaned back in the plush leather chair, rubbing my aching temples as the freezing reality began to settle in. I closed my tired eyes, and suddenly, a deeply buried memory cut through my confusion. The answer wasn't a simple case of traditional forgery. The answer was a dangerous weapon that I had willingly handed over to my own daughter. 5 years ago, I had experienced a sudden medical scare. I was working alone in the detached garage, carefully sanding down a beautiful piece of reclaimed oak for a new dining table, when a sudden, crushing tightness seized my chest, and the world lost focus completely. It turned out to be nothing more than a minor issue with my blood pressure, easily managed with a strict change in my daily diet and basic prescription medication. But out of an abundance of caution, the doctors kept me in the local hospital for 2 days of observation. The sterile hospital room was incredibly cold and lonely, constantly reminding me of the tragic night I lost my dear wife. Natalie had rushed to my bedside the moment she heard the news. Looking back now, I realize she put on a flawless performance as a terrified, devoted daughter. She sat by the sterile bedside for hours, her eyes red and swollen from crying, holding my rough, calloused hands in her soft ones. She told me over and over again how terrified she was of losing her only remaining parent. She begged me to take responsibility for an uncertain future, to be realistic. With tears streaming down her face, she presented me with a thick, professionally bound legal document. She called it a standard medical and financial power of attorney. She swore to me, on her late mother's memory, that it was merely a necessary precaution. A simple, harmless safety net, just in case I ever became severely incapacitated and couldn't make major life decisions for myself. I was physically exhausted, heavily medicated, and completely overwhelmed by the unconditional love an aging father feels for a deeply worried child. I trusted her absolutely with my life. Without a single thought, I signed the legal document, willingly granting her the absolute legal authority to act on my behalf in any financial or medical capacity. The bitter memory made me physically sick as I opened my eyes in Derek's quiet, dimly lit office. That signed document was never meant to be a loving safety net. It was a blank check. It was a loaded weapon that she had kept safely tucked away in her back pocket for 5 long years, patiently waiting for the perfect moment of tragedy to pull the trigger. She had used that comprehensive power of attorney to completely bypass my direct consent legally. With that notarized piece of paper, she could easily walk into any commercial bank, sit confidently across from any senior loan officer, and legally sign my name to a massive financial burden without ever needing my physical presence or verbal permission. The official, notary stamp on the fraudulent loan agreement wasn't verifying that I was sitting in that room. It was officially verifying that my legally designated representative, my own flesh and blood, was legally authorizing the catastrophic destruction of my life's savings. She had cruelly weaponized my own eventual mortality and my deep love for her against me. The profound weight of total betrayal felt completely suffocating. I desperately needed to see the full extent of the financial damage for myself. I needed to know exactly how deep this toxic wound actually went. Reaching into the pocket of my faded denim jeans, I pulled out my smartphone. I was a simple man of highly predictable, old-school habits. I lived quite comfortably on my hard-earned pension and the modest savings I had slowly built up over a long life of demanding physical labor. Because of that, I rarely ever checked my online banking portal. My monthly expenses were incredibly low. I didn't buy flashy things, and I absolutely never gambled with my hard-won financial security. My calloused hands shook so violently in the quiet room that it took me 3 frustrating attempts just to type in my secure digital passcode. The small digital screen illuminated my tired, lined face as the banking application slowly loaded. I navigated to the main dashboard, preparing my fragile heart for whatever horrific financial reality lay ahead. My standard checking account balance appeared at the top of the bright screen. It looked completely normal, entirely untouched. But right underneath it, a brand new account line had been freshly created under my name. It was clearly labeled as a home equity line of credit. The available balance on that massive loan read $0. My heart painfully skipped a beat. A loan of $600,000 had been fully approved and completely drained. I tapped rapidly on the recent transaction history for that specific account. The stolen funds hadn't stayed in my name for even a single minute. Exactly 3 days ago, a massive outgoing wire transfer had been initiated. It was sent to a mysterious corporate entity named Apex Holdings LLC. I stared at those three words glowing on the digital screen. Apex Holdings LLC. The name meant absolutely nothing to me, but the terrifying reality settled heavily into my tired bones. $600,000 of my hard-earned legacy had vanished into thin air at 2 o'clock in the morning. I slowly closed the banking app and looked up at the expensive walls of Derek's home office. My grief over my brother's passing was still a heavy anchor, but a sharper emotion was rapidly taking over. Pure determination. I was not going to be a silent victim. I was a structural engineer. When a building shows signs of a catastrophic collapse, you don't sit down and cry. You bring in the heavy machinery, and you dig out the rot. I picked up my phone, scrolled past my daughter's name, and stopped on Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan wasn't just a lawyer. He was a ruthless corporate litigator, a legal white shark who demolished corrupt executives in federal courtrooms. More importantly, he owed me a massive favor. Back in the 90s, Jonathan's father owned a commercial high-rise that was sinking due to a compromised foundation. Every other firm told him it had to be demolished. I spent 3 months in the mud, designing a custom steel underpinning system that saved his father from total bankruptcy. Jonathan had sworn that if I ever needed anything, all it took was a single phone call. I pressed the button. The digital clock showed exactly 2:00 a.m. The phone rang 3 times before a groggy voice answered, demanding to know who was calling at this hour. I didn't apologize. I just said his name and told him it was Harrison Cole. The impatience in his tone vanished instantly. I heard the rustle of blankets and the click of a bedside lamp turning on. He asked what was wrong. I took a deep breath and laid out the entire nightmare. I told him about the skipped funeral, the fake merger, the trip to Aspen, the forged appraisal, and the fraudulent home equity line of credit. Finally, I gave him the name of the entity holding my savings. Jonathan didn't offer empty sympathy. He offered immediate action. I heard him walk down a hallway, open a door, and then the rapid, mechanical clatter of a computer keyboard. He told me to stay on the line. For 20 straight minutes, the only sound was the frantic typing of a master litigator, hacking through layers of corporate obfuscation. Jonathan had access to advanced financial databases and private federal court registries that the general public never sees. He began pulling on the digital threads of Apex Holdings LLC. His voice broke the silence, cold and analytical. He told me that Apex was a ghost. It was an anonymous shell company registered in Delaware just 3 weeks ago. The registered agent was a post office box, and the officers were hidden behind a privacy shield. But Jonathan was an apex predator in these waters. He bypassed the state registry and dug deep into the corresponding tax identification numbers and bank routing codes. He cross-referenced those numbers with Illinois commercial real estate licenses. A heavy sigh came through the phone's speaker. He had found the absolute link. The shell company was secretly registered by an affiliated law firm that directly represented Derek. I asked Jonathan why Derek would go to such elaborate, illegal lengths to steal the equity from my house. If his brokerage firm was simply struggling in a tough market, he could have just filed for bankruptcy legally. Jonathan's typing grew even more aggressive. He told me he was pulling up the civil litigation records for Derek's primary firm. Suddenly, Jonathan let out a low, sharp whistle. The truth wasn't just a failing business. It was a massive, sprawling criminal empire. Jonathan read the confidential legal documents aloud to me in the dark. Derek wasn't just losing money. He was actively being sued by 3 separate groups of powerful private investors who were accusing him of catastrophic embezzlement. For the past 4 years, Derek had been running a massive, complex financial shell game, a Ponzi scheme. He had been using millions of dollars from new investors to pay off older ones, all while secretly skimming massive amounts of cash to fund his own extravagant lifestyle. The custom Italian suits, the brand new luxury cars, the exclusive ski trips to Colorado. None of it was actually earned. It was all stolen money. And now the entire house of cards was collapsing directly on top of him. The investors had filed for an emergency injunction. If Derek couldn't produce a massive cash settlement by the end of this month to appease them, they were turning a massive mountain of evidence over to federal authorities. The $600,000 stolen from my house wasn't an investment. It was dirty blood money. It was a desperate, panicked attempt to pay off a legal settlement and keep Derek out of a federal prison jumpsuit. A sickening wave of betrayal washed over me. My own daughter was willing to sacrifice my absolute financial security just to save her criminal husband from a prison cell. I prepared to ask Jonathan how we could freeze the stolen funds, how we could immediately contact the National Bank's fraud division to shut down this horrific nightmare once and for all. But suddenly, the rapid, aggressive typing on the other end of the line stopped completely. The silence on the wire was deep and incredibly unsettling. It stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds. When Jonathan finally spoke again, his voice was completely altered. The confident, analytical tone of the corporate shark was gone. Instead, there was a quiet, fearful hesitation. He took a slow, shaky breath. He said, "Harrison, I need you to brace yourself right now. They weren't just stealing the money to pay off Derek's debts. Look at your private email inbox immediately. I just forwarded you the official family court docket for next Monday morning." My hands went completely numb as I minimized the banking window and opened my private email application. The bright screen felt like a blinding spotlight in the quiet, dark room. Sitting right at the very top of my inbox was an encrypted, secure message from Jonathan Pierce. It contained a heavy digital attachment, a PDF document titled Emergency Petition for Full Conservatorship. With a trembling finger, I clicked the file and watched it slowly load across the screen, a suffocating pressure building deep inside my chest. The very first page bore the official seal of the state family court system in bold black ink. I read the formal legal header printed across the top. Petitioner Natalie Cole. Respondent Harrison Cole. My own daughter. The child I had spent my entire life protecting and providing for, was officially suing me for complete legal control over my physical autonomy and my financial independence. I read through the opening paragraphs, my stomach turning violently at every calculated, emotionless legal word. She was officially petitioning a federal judge to declare me completely mentally incompetent and unable to manage my own basic human affairs. Suddenly, the last 6 months of my life flashed before my eyes, rapidly transforming from innocent memories into a horrific, calculated nightmare. Since the beginning of the year, Natalie had shown an extraordinary interest and active involvement in my personal health. She had insisted over and over again that the doctor I had trusted for 20 years was completely outdated in his methods. She constantly pushed me to see a highly specialized, expensive private physician she claimed to have found across town. She enthusiastically offered to drive me to every single appointment. She sat right next to me in the sterile examination rooms, answering the doctor's medical questions carefully before I could even open my mouth to speak. She would place a falsely comforting hand on my shoulder, telling the man in the white coat that I was always forgetting simple things, that I missed my house keys every single day, and that I got hopelessly lost while taking walks around your own familiar neighborhood. At the time, I foolishly thought she was just an overprotective daughter, naturally anxious about her aging father. I would playfully roll my eyes and assure the stern doctor that I was completely fine, dismissing her exaggerated stories as normal family worry. But now, sitting alone in Derek's office, the chilling truth hit me with the brutal force of a speeding freight train. She wasn't protecting me from anything. She was methodically building a false paper trail to systematically destroy me. She was patiently laying the complex groundwork to permanently steal my absolute freedom. I slid my finger down the digital screen, reviewing the supporting medical evidence that had been strategically attached to the legal petition. There were 3 official evaluation letters signed by the same shady private doctor. These clinical records were an absolute work of malicious fiction regarding my true mental state. In bold lettering, the doctor explicitly stated that I was suffering from severe, rapidly progressing dementia. He falsely claimed that I experienced frequent, terrifying, paranoid delusions on a weekly basis. With supposed absolute medical authority, he even wrote that I had recently begun displaying sudden, uncontrollable violent tendencies, posing a severe physical danger to myself and the surrounding family members. I was reading a chilling description of a terrifying stranger, a violent lunatic who belonged safely locked away in a psychiatric ward, not the quiet, gentle structural engineer who spent his peaceful weekends carefully crafting wooden birdhouses for his beloved grandchildren. The legal document clearly outlined her ultimate, devastating demands. If the presiding judge granted this emergency motion on Monday morning, Natalie would immediately be awarded absolute, irrevocable control over every single aspect of the rest of my life. She would have the unrestricted legal power to liquidate my secure bank accounts, sell my historic craftsman home right out from under me to pay off Derek's Sexip's massive criminal debts, and forcefully lock me away in a restrictive psychiatric care facility completely against my will. In the blink of an eye, I would permanently lose my home, my hard-earned life's legacy, and my basic human dignity. I would become a helpless prisoner, completely controlled by my own flesh and blood. Reading through the damning document once more, my engineer's brain desperately fought against the rising tide of my own emotional panic. I had spent my entire adult life meticulously analyzing structural systems, constantly looking for the hidden weak points in massive architectural designs. The federal legal system was just another structure. It relied heavily on solid foundational evidence to support its massive claims. I stared intensely at the forged medical evaluations. Yes, they were devastating, but they were still just typed pages from a single private physician. The strict legal standard required for an emergency, immediate conservatorship that bypassed a standard jury trial demanded something far more substantial. A judge would not strip a fully functioning adult man based exclusively on exaggerated doctor visits and the worried testimony of a greedy daughter. The court would absolutely demand undeniable, concrete proof that I was an immediate physical danger to society. They needed a catalyst. They needed a recent, heavily documented incident to finally prove the violent instability claimed by that corrupt doctor. The petition strongly referenced a highly volatile and dangerous psychological state. But it was conspicuously missing that final, defining piece of evidence required to secure a judge's signature. I slowly put the digital tablet down, staring blindly into the dark shadows of the room. Why would they leave for a luxury vacation just 2 days before launching such a massive legal assault? Why intentionally provoke me by callously forcing me to miss my heroic brother's sacred funeral? The blood turned to absolute ice in my veins. They needed me to break. They needed me to lose control. To secure that emergency conservatorship, they needed immediate, undeniable proof of my violent instability. Pushing the digital tablet away, my mind raced as I calculated the terrifying implications of their timeline. If they needed a heavily documented incident to present to a federal judge on Monday morning, then this entire weekend wasn't just a convenient vacation for them. It was a meticulously designed psychological trap, and I needed to know exactly how they planned to spring it. I turned my attention away from the heavy mahogany desk and looked toward a sleek silver laptop sitting quietly on a side table. Derek had always been notoriously arrogant about his own intellect. He frequently scoffed at security protocols in his office, regularly leaving his devices in sleep mode rather than shutting them down completely. I walked over and gave the trackpad a gentle tap. The screen immediately flared to life, completely bypassing the login screen because the device was still connected to his home network. I minimized his crowded email inbox and scanned the open applications running in the background. My gaze locked onto a small gray icon shaped like a microphone. It was a professional audio recording software, typically used for archiving lengthy meetings. The program was still open, displaying a full timeline of recent files. The most recent file had been created just 2 days prior. The title of the file was simply labeled Legal Strategy Session. Plugging a pair of expensive noise-canceling headphones into the side of the laptop, I placed them carefully over my ears and hit the play button. A sharp hiss of static filled my ears, followed immediately by the familiar arrogant throat clearing of my son-in-law. Derek was speaking to a man with a deep, commanding voice. From their formal tone, I quickly deduced that this was the aggressive family court attorney they had hired to orchestrate my legal destruction. The attorney sounded impatient. He explicitly warned Derek and Natalie that the forged medical paperwork and the private doctor's testimony would only skiff their spoolie, would only get their foot in the courtroom door. He pointed out that judges are inherently skeptical of sudden substantial financial inheritance, especially when a substantial financial inheritance is hanging. The lawyer told them that unless they could provide irrefutable, undeniable evidence of immediate danger, the judge would likely order a lengthy, independent medical evaluation, which would completely stall their timeline and expose the fraudulent bank loan. Then, I heard my daughter's voice. It was the same sweet voice she had used 30 years ago, but now it was dripping with a chilling, calculated malice. She told the attorney not to worry about an independent evaluation. She assured him that they would provide a perfect, convicting piece of evidence by Sunday evening. I gripped the edge of the desk, my knuckles turning completely white as I listened to my own child outline her master trap. Natalie explained her strategy with the cold precision of a military general planning an ambush. She said, "My uncle's funeral is this Sunday. My dad has been mourning his brother all week. He's physically exhausted, completely heartbroken, and highly emotional right now. We're going to pack our bags and tell him we have a sudden make-or-break business trip. We'll drop the kids on him at the very last second, forcing him to miss the service entirely." He will be absolutely furious. He'll be severely sleep-deprived, overwhelmed by grief, and completely run down, taking care of two high-energy kids all by himself. We are going to push him to his absolute breaking point. The attorney asked how missing a funeral would prove late-stage dementia and violent tendencies. Derek's voice cut in, filled with a cruel amusement. Derek explained that they knew exactly how to trigger my deepest frustrations. They knew I was a fiercely proud man of incredibly rigid routines. By trapping me in my own house while I was mourning the most important person in my life, they were creating a pressure cooker of raw emotional pain. They were actively counting on my immense grief manifesting as an uncontrollable, explosive rage. Natalie confidently told the attorney that I would eventually snap, she said. He'll lose his temper. He'll scream at the kids. He might even throw something against the wall out of pure frustration. When he does, we'll have it all captured on high-definition video as perfect proof of his violent instability. The judge will have absolutely no choice but to sign the emergency conservatorship order immediately. The breath caught sharply in my throat. Video? How could they possibly capture high-definition video inside my house when they were thousands of miles away? The attorney asked them. That exact same question. Natalie let out a soft, dark laugh that caused my stomach to churn violently. She said, Derek spent the entire week wiring the house. We have complete coverage. Hidden cameras will capture every single second of his melt. Down. The audio recording continued to play, but I could no longer process the treacherous words. A deafening ringing completely consumed my ears. Hidden cameras. My own flesh and blood, along with her criminal husband, had secretly wired my home to document my lowest, most vulnerable moment. They had turned my safe haven into a digital prison designed to destroy my life. Slowly, I removed the heavy headphones from my ears, letting them drop onto the desk. The quiet home office suddenly felt incredibly small and deeply sinister. Every shadow seemed to hold a dark secret. Every corner felt like a physical threat. I stood perfectly still, controlling my ragged breathing with the strict discipline of an experienced engineer. I slowly raised my head, scanning the expensive artwork hanging on the walls. My gaze traveled up to the ceiling, tracing the path of the electrical wiring. I stopped. Positioned directly above Derek's heavy mahogany desk was a standard circular smoke detector. I stared intensely at the small plastic grill. Deep inside the dark plastic vents, a tiny, unblinking red light stared straight back at me. My first instinct was violent. I wanted to rip the heavy brass lamp from the corner of the mahogany desk and smash that plastic smoke detector into 1,000 jagged pieces. I wanted to scream into the hidden microphone, letting them know that I had discovered their disgusting, treacherous trap. But I didn't move a single muscle. The structural engineer in my mind took over instantly, suppressing the raw, burning rage of a betrayed father. When you discover a massive structural flaw in a building, you don't just take a sledgehammer to the load-bearing walls. If you strike out blindly, the entire roof will collapse directly on top of you, burying you beneath the rubble of your own impulsive fury. You have to step back, analyze the complex framing, locate the central pillar holding the toxic structure together, and dismantle it with absolute, silent precision. I slowly shifted my gaze away from the ceiling, making it look as though I were merely stretching my tired neck. Quietly closing the silver laptop, I wiped away my fingerprints from the smooth trackpad, walked out of the dark home office, and clicked the heavy oak door shut behind me. I went back to the guest bedroom and lay down in the dark, staring at the ceiling until the sun began to rise. I was not going to give them the explosive, violent reaction they so desperately craved. I was going to give them the exact opposite. When Sunday morning arrived, the exact day of my beloved brother's funeral, I did not shed a single visible tear. I forced my deep grief into the furthest depths of my soul, locking it behind a heavy door forged from pure determination. I walked into the kitchen with a bright, cheerful smile on my face. Opening the massive stainless steel refrigerator, I pulled out eggs, milk, and fresh blueberries. I began mixing pancake batter from scratch, humming a lively, upbeat tune loud enough for the hidden microphones to capture clearly. When little Leo and Mia woke up and shuffled into the kitchen rubbing their sleepy eyes, I greeted them with a genuine, joyful laugh. I scooped Mia up into the air, spinning her around as her sweet giggles filled the room. I let Leo help me flip the golden pancakes on the hot griddle, guiding his small hands patiently. Throughout the entire pleasant breakfast, I maintained the absolute perfect image of a loving, patient, and emotionally stable grandfather. I told them funny stories from my childhood, asked them engaging questions about their favorite school subjects, and made sure my voice remained calm, measured, and completely devoid of any frustration. But, while I was smiling and serving warm maple syrup, my sharp, analytical eyes were actively scanning every single inch of the open living space. I was systematically mapping out the digital boundaries. I spotted a second hidden camera, tucked neatly inside the hollowed-out spine of a decorative fake book on the living room bookshelf. While I found a third one perfectly concealed behind the dark glass of the digital smart clock on the kitchen countertop. Using my decades of experience in spatial geometry and architectural drafting, I calculated the precise viewing angles and focal lengths of each tiny lens in my head. I mapped out the overlapping fields of vision, and more importantly, I pinpointed the exact narrow blind spots where their digital eyes couldn't reach. I knew exactly where to stand in the hallway to remain completely invisible. I knew precisely what angle in the dining room would block my hand movements from the kitchen camera. I was no longer a helpless victim trapped in a digital cage. I was an architect navigating my own blueprint. By 10 a.m., the kids had finished their hearty breakfast and were happily curled up on the plush living room sofa. I turned on the massive flat-screen television and found their absolute favorite animated movie. I made sure they had plenty of soft blankets and a large bowl of fresh fruit snacks. Standing right in the center of the living room, I looked directly toward the hidden camera concealed in the bookshelf. I smiled warmly and announced in a clear, incredibly cheerful, "White's wash a load of laundry for them," that I was going to wash a load of laundry about chores so their parents wouldn't from their stressful chores when they returned from their stressful trip. Picking up a plastic laundry basket, I casually strolled out of the camera's wide frame. The moment I stepped across that invisible threshold into the designated blind spot, the cheerful smile vanished entirely from my face, replaced by a cold, rock-solid determination. Rock-solid determination. I wasn't going to the laundry room. I had a far more important technical task to complete. I knew that professional-grade, high-definition surveillance cameras recording continuous video and audio required a massive amount of digital storage. TID. Rely on a basic wireless connection to upload to an external cloud, especially given the heavy firewall Derek Business Files prided himself on for his business files. They had to be hardwired to a central physical hub located somewhere completely out of sight within the house. I quietly opened the door to the basement and crept down the wooden stairs, my rubber-soled shoes making absolutely no sound on the steps. The basement was a large, unfinished, concrete space, used primarily for storing old holiday decorations and heavy workout equipment. I walked past dusty cardboard boxes, following a thick bundle of heavily insulated black cables that were securely routed along the wooden ceiling joists. The thick wiring led directly to a locked, ventilated metal utility closet tucked away in the furthest, darkest corner of the cold basement. Pulling the metal tension wrench from my pocket, I quickly picked the cheap lock on the utility door. Inside, a server box sat firmly on a shelf. I plugged my encrypted hard drive into the server. Staring at the pulsing green lights on the heavy metal server box, I watched as the digital progress bar slowly filled on the small monitor screen. My encrypted hard drive hummed faintly in the damp, cold basement air, systematically copying every single byte of their treacherous surveillance footage. I opened the file directory and clicked on the most recent video segment. The screen bloomed to life, showing a high-definition, wide-angle view of the living room upstairs. I watched myself carrying the plastic laundry basket across the floor, smiling and looking completely oblivious to their eyes, but in my eyes, completely in control. I had absolute proof of their calculated trap. They had meticulously recorded my every move, intending to capture a manufactured breakdown, but instead, they perfectly documented my complete sanity and their own malice. Seftu. Once the transfer finished entirely, I safely ejected my hard drive and slid it deep into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans. I carefully closed the door to the metal utility closet, ensuring it looked completely undisturbed. Walking back upstairs into the kitchen, I checked on my grandchildren, who were still completely engrossed in the animated movie on the television. I stepped out onto the secluded back patio, closing the sliding glass door tightly behind me to muffle any sound. The crisp afternoon air filled my lungs. I pulled out my phone and dialed Jonathan Pierce for the second time this weekend. The phone rang only once before he picked up, his voice sharp and fully alert, despite it being a Sunday afternoon. I quickly updated him on the hidden cameras I had discovered and the audio recording I had successfully pulled from Derek's laptop regarding their master plan. I told him that they were intentionally trying to manufacture a violent incident to secure the emergency conservatorship on Monday morning. Jonathan went quiet for a moment, absorbing the sheer cruelty of my daughter's strategy. He let out a heavy sigh, telling me that we needed to file a counter-injunction immediately to stop the conservatorship application. But he was worried about the massive $600,000 loan they had already secured against my house. Unraveling a legally binding financial contract of that magnitude, he said, could take years of exhausting and incredibly expensive litigation in civil court. A small, cold smile crept onto the corners of my mouth as I stood on the wooden deck looking out over the manicured backyard. I told Jonathan that we weren't going to waste time fighting in civil court. I told him it was finally time to execute Plan B. He sounded genuinely confused, asking me what I meant by that. I reminded him of a quiet Tuesday afternoon, exactly 2 years ago, when I had paid an unexpected visit to his downtown law firm. 2 years prior, during the week of Thanksgiving, I had come home early from a routine grocery run. I walked into my bedroom and discovered Natalie kneeling on the floor of my walk-in closet. She had a set of metal lock-picking tools in her hands and was desperately trying to force open the heavy steel lockbox where I kept my most sensitive personal documents and family heirlooms. When I confronted her, she immediately burst into dramatic tears, claiming she was simply looking for an old recipe card that belonged to her late mother and had gotten confused about where it was stored. To avoid ruining the family holiday, I accepted her flimsy excuse at the time. But my deep-seated instincts were screaming at me. A daughter doesn't secretly pick a heavy steel lock just to find a recipe card. That very afternoon, while she was busy baking pies in the kitchen, I drove straight to Jonathan's office. I sat in his leather chair and instructed him to immediately and permanently revoke the comprehensive power of attorney I had foolishly signed for her in the hospital 3 years earlier. We drafted a brand new, ironclad legal document that completely stripped Natalie of any and all access to my medical or financial decisions. We filed the revocation officially with the state registry, rendering the original document absolutely null and void in the eyes of the law. I simply never told her I did it. I let her go on, believing she held the ultimate key to my life, waiting to see if she would ever be greedy enough to actually try and use it against me. I stood alone on the quiet outdoor patio, looking out over the yard, listening to the gentle morning breeze rustle through the leaves of the tall oak trees. I explained to Jonathan that the original power of attorney Natalie had proudly presented to the National Bank last week was legally dead. It was nothing more than a worthless piece of scrap paper, officially revoked and completely invalidated 24 months ago. I heard a sudden, sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. Jonathan's brilliant legal mind rapidly processed the immense implications of what I had just revealed to him. The silence stretched for over 10 seconds before a low, dark chuckle rumbled through the speaker. "Harrison," he said, "if that power of attorney was legally invalid 2 years ago, then she had absolutely zero legal authority to sign your name to those banking documents." He paused, the heavy weight of impending justice settling firmly into his voice. "Harrison, that $600,000 loan she took out last week isn't just a standard case of elder abuse or simple civil theft. By intentionally presenting a revoked legal document to a federally insured financial institution to extract hundreds of thousands of dollars, she crossed a massive legal line. That is federal bank fraud. And the penalty for defrauding a national bank out of over $500,000 is a severe, mandatory federal prison sentence that she cannot escape. Jonathan's words hung heavy in the crisp afternoon air. Federal bank fraud. A mandatory federal prison sentence. I stood on the wooden deck with the phone pressed tightly to my ear, processing the absolute destruction that was about to rain down on my family. I had spent most of my career building structures designed to withstand catastrophic collapses. But there is no blueprint that teaches you how to survive the collapse of your own flesh and blood. Thanking Jonathan for his brilliant legal mind, I told him to prepare the necessary documentation for the authorities. I ended the call. My mind turned immediately back to the 2 innocent souls sitting in the living room, Leo and Mia. If Natalie and Derek faced severe federal prosecution, the kids would be the immediate collateral damage. They would be thrust into the chaotic state foster care system and permanently traumatized. I needed to provide a safe foundation for them, someone completely removed from the toxic, criminal corruption of their parents. I thought of Derek's parents, Richard and Martha. They were inherently decent, hard-working people. Richard was a retired history teacher, and Martha had spent 30 years working as a pediatric nurse. They lived a modest life, completely blinded by the flashy, superficial success their son constantly paraded in front of them. They truly believed Derek was a brilliant, honest businessman. I knew the truth would completely shatter their hearts, but I also knew they loved their grandchildren fiercely. Pulling out my phone, I dialed Richard's number. When he answered, his voice was warm, completely oblivious to the impending nightmare. I skipped the pleasantries entirely. Lowering my voice to a tense whisper, I told him that a severe, life-altering emergency involving Leo and Mia had just unfolded. I instructed him to grab Martha and drive to my house this very second. His son toxicity. I specifically warned them to park their car a full block away, walk quietly through the back alleyway, and enter only through the sliding glass doors on the back patio. Richard didn't ask any unnecessary questions. The sheer urgency in my voice was enough. Less than 40 minutes later, I saw them hurrying across the yard, their faces pale with deep concern. I quickly slid the glass door open and ushered them inside, pressing a finger to my lips to demand absolute silence. Carefully guiding them through the precise digital blind spots I had mapped out earlier, I led them directly to a secluded corner of the formal dining room, completely out of reach from the hidden cameras. The children remained deeply engrossed in their movie in the adjacent living room, completely unaware of the silent gathering. Martha gripped my arm tightly, her eyes wide with fear, silently begging me to explain what was happening. I didn't attempt to soften the devastating blow. Pulling the photocopied financial documents from my jacket pocket, I spread them across the smooth mahogany dining table. I walked them through every single horrifying detail. I showed them the forged appraisal report on my historic Craftsman home, pulled out the fraudulent home equity line of credit agreement, pointing directly to the expertly forged signature at the bottom of the page. Then I revealed the civil litigation documents Jonathan had emailed to me. I watched the color completely drain from Richard's face as he read the formal legal filings, outlining the massive corporate embezzlement charges against his only son. He read the staggering numbers, realizing that Derek's luxurious lifestyle was funded entirely by millions of dollars of stolen investor money. Martha covered her mouth with trembling hands, shaking her head in fierce denial. She whispered desperately, saying it had to be a massive misunderstanding, that her son would never commit such horrific crimes. I knew financial betrayal was hard to accept, so I brought out the most devastating piece of evidence. Pulling out my digital tablet, I plugged in the encrypted hard drive and opened the audio file I had extracted from Derek's laptop. I handed Martha a pair of headphones. I watched her tear-filled eyes widen in absolute horror as the recording played. She heard her own son callously mocking my brother's funeral. She listened as Natalie coldly outlined her master plan to weaponize my deep grief. And worst of all, she heard them explicitly discuss using Leo and Mia as emotional bait to intentionally push a grieving grandfather to the brink of a violent mental breakdown, solely to secure a fraudulent conservatorship. When the recording finished playing, Martha collapsed into Richard's arms, sobbing uncontrollably against his shoulder. The heavy, muffled sound of her breaking heart filled the quiet dining room corner. Richard held his wife tightly, his jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth would shatter. The deep, unconditional love he held for his son was instantly replaced by a fierce, protective rage for his innocent grandchildren. He looked up at me, his eyes burning with intense sorrow and absolute clarity. He asked me what we needed to do, to protect the children from the monsters they had raised. Placing a gentle, steady hand on Richard's shoulder, I instructed him to go to the kids' bedrooms and quietly pack their clothes and toys into suitcases. Enough for several weeks. I told them to take Leo and Mia out through the back patio, load them into the car, parked down the street, and drive straight home without looking back. Martha wiped her tear-stained cheeks, her voice trembling as she asked what would happen when Derek and Natalie finally returned from their fake business trip. I looked directly into her terror-filled eyes, my voice dropping to a cold, unwavering whisper. At exactly 6 o'clock tonight, a massive, dangerous storm is going to hit this house, I told her. And I absolutely do not want my sweet, innocent grandchildren sitting in the front living room, watching their own parents being thrown into heavy steel handcuffs and dragged out the front door. Richard and Martha nodded in grim understanding. They didn't hesitate for another second. They slipped quietly into the guest rooms where I had temporarily stored the overnight bags, the kids' overnight bags, and began packing frantically. Martha walked into the living room, masking her deep despair with a gentle, grandmotherly smile, and told Leo and Mia that they were going on a special surprise adventure to their house. The kids let out a soft cheer, completely oblivious to the horrific reality hovering over their heads. Standing by the sliding glass door, I watched them walk safely across the grass, holding tightly to their grandparents' hands. Once they disappeared into the alleyway, I locked the heavy glass door and pulled the thick curtains shut. The massive suburban home was finally completely empty. The silence that settled over the rooms was absolute and profoundly suffocating. I walked slowly into the formal dining room, the crushing weight of the entire day pressing down on my tired shoulders. I stepped up to the expensive crystal decanter sitting on Derek's polished wooden bar. I picked up 2 heavy glass tumblers. It was finally time to pay tribute to the man who gave me everything. I glanced up at the massive grandfather clock standing in the long hallway. The polished brass hands rested perfectly at 2 o'clock. Out in a quiet, peaceful cemetery on the edge of the city, my beloved brother Bill was officially being lowered into the cold, damp earth. I wasn't there standing beside his wooden casket. I wasn't there to place a final flower on his resting place. I was trapped inside a digital prison built by my own treacherous daughter. Unscrewing the heavy glass stopper of the crystal decanter, I poured a generous, dark amber splash of whiskey, filling both glasses. Picking them up, I walked slowly into the exact center of the living room, fully aware that the hidden camera in the bookshelf was watching my every move. I didn't care anymore. I set one glass down on the mahogany coffee table, placing it gently on a dark leather coaster. I held the other glass in my rough, calloused right hand. Looking at the empty space directly across from me, I pictured my brother sitting there, his thick wooden cane resting against his knee. The deep, agonizing grief I had suppressed all morning finally welled up intensely in my chest. Raising my glass, I began to speak aloud to the empty room. My voice was low, steady, and filled with a lifetime of profound gratitude and overwhelming heartbreak. Bill, I am so incredibly sorry I couldn't be with you today, I said. I am so sorry I couldn't stand by your open grave and tell the world what a truly honorable, brave man you were. I took a slow sip of the burning whiskey, letting the sharp heat steady my racing mind. I continued talking to the silent shadows, telling him about the horrific betrayal I had uncovered. I told him about the forged bank papers, the hundreds of thousands of dollars stolen, and the malicious, calculated plot to lock me away in a restrictive psychiatric ward. I promised him that the massive, painful sacrifice he made back in 1985 had not been in vain. "You broke your own body to save my life, Bill," I said. "You gave me a miraculous second chance to build a family. I spent a lifetime trying to build a beautiful, solid foundation for my daughter. But the materials I used were deeply flawed. The structure I built rotted entirely from the inside out. As a structural engineer, I know you can't just put a fresh coat of paint on a failing, collapsing foundation. You have to tear it all down and level it to the ground, no matter how much it breaks your heart, so you can save the innocent people standing nearby. Today, I am tearing it all down, brother. I am protecting the young grandchildren you never got to watch grow up." Sinking heavily into the soft leather sofa, I rested my tired elbows on my knees and spent the next 3 hours in absolute, uninterrupted silence, sipping my warm whiskey. I watched the bright, golden afternoon sunlight crawl slowly across the floor, casting long, dark shadows ominously through the empty living room. I rehearsed every intricate detail of the coming confrontation in my mind. I steadied my frayed nerves, deliberately turning my vulnerable, broken heart into cold, indestructible steel. I could not afford to show even an ounce of weakness or sympathy when the heavy trap finally closed. I knew all too well that Natalie would immediately try to emotionally manipulate my deep fatherly instincts with her dramatic tears. I knew Derek would try to aggressively intimidate me with his arrogant, explosive anger. I had to be an absolutely immovable object against their impending storm. The long, agonizing hours ticked past, the quiet tension in the house building to a suffocating, almost unbearable point. I slowly stood up from the leather sofa, my aging joints aching with a deep, profound exhaustion. Carefully, carrying the 2 empty crystal whiskey glasses into the modern kitchen, I washed them thoroughly in the stainless steel sink and placed them neatly in the wooden drying rack. Walking back into the living room, I sat back down in the dim, fading light. I waited patiently in the rapidly approaching darkness. Suddenly, the deep, resonant chime of the grandfather clock echoed heavily through the silent hallway. It was exactly 5:45 p.m. After a few tense, agonizing moments, the heavy silence of the affluent suburban neighborhood was abruptly shattered. I heard the distinct, heavy crunch of expensive rubber tires rolling slowly over the gravel driveway just outside the massive front window. The luxury vacationers had finally returned. The heavy front door swung open, breaking the silence of the dark living room. I remained completely motionless on the leather sofa, shrouded in the shadows, keeping myself hidden from their line of sight. Natalie walked in first, letting out an exaggerated sigh that echoed through the foyer. She was dressed in a professional suit, playing the part of an exhausted corporate executive perfectly. Derek followed closely behind, pulling loose his necktie and rubbing his neck, as if he had just spent days pounding the pavement at a conference table. They weren't carrying the snowboards or ski goggles I knew they had packed into the trunk. Instead, they gripped sleek leather briefcases, completing their carefully constructed visual lie. I watched them put on this deceptive performance, feeling a cold detachment replace whatever final shred of paternal warmth I had left. They tossed their heavy keys into a ceramic bowl by the door, the sharp clinking cutting through the quiet air. Derek began complaining loudly about a bumpy flight back from New York, intentionally raising his voice so it carried throughout the house. He claimed the merger negotiations were absolutely brutal, but that they had miraculously managed to save his company at the absolute last second. It was a perfectly rehearsed script, designed to make me feel small and guilty for ever doubting the crucial importance of their trip. I sat quietly in the dark, my hands resting calmly on my lap, letting them dig their own graves just a little deeper. Kicking off her high heels, Natalie walked into the living room, fumbling blindly along the wall for the switch. As her hand brushed the plastic panel, she caught sight of my silent silhouette in the dim light. She let out a sudden, sharp gasp, stumbling backward in a perfectly orchestrated display of fright. She clutched her chest in manufactured panic. She flipped the switch, and harsh light instantly flooded the room, making my tired eyes sting briefly. I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I just sat there, looking up directly at my daughter. The brief surprise on her face quickly melted into a calculated look of concern. This was the exact moment they had been waiting for all weekend. This was the highly anticipated climax of their psychological trap. She deliberately took a step forward, carefully positioning her body so that the hidden camera, tucked inside the hollowed-out book on the bookshelf behind her, could perfectly capture her facial expressions. I could see the malicious anticipation dancing in her eyes. She was waiting for the explosion. She was waiting for the grieving old man to finally snap under the weight of their cruel abandonment. Crossing her arms tightly over her chest, she narrowed her eyes and dropped her voice into a tone of patronizing pity mixed with sharp accusation. "Why on earth are you sitting here in the pitch black, Dad?" she asked, looking around the empty living room, her eyes scanning the perfectly clean kitchen and the quiet hallway. Taking another step closer, she raised her voice slightly, ensuring the hidden microphones caught every single word of her provocation. "Are you losing your mind again? What is wrong with you? You're acting completely creepy. Where are my children? Where are Leo and Mia? Did you forget to feed them? Are they hiding in their rooms because you started screaming at them again?" She delivered these cruel accusations with absolute conviction, painting a horrific picture of a dangerous, demented man who had completely lost touch with reality. Derek stepped up right behind her, crossing his arms and shaking his head in mock disgust. Looking down at me, he said, "We trusted you to watch them for just one weekend, Harrison. We trusted you while we went to save our family from financial ruin, and we come back to find you sitting in the dark like an absolute lunatic. What did you do with our kids?" They stood together, a formidable wall of arrogance and deception, fully expecting me to leap from the sofa in a blind, furious rage. They expected me to scream about my brother's funeral. They expected me to wave my arms in desperation, curse their names, and provide them with the exact high-definition evidence they needed to lock me away in a secure psychiatric ward on Monday morning. I stared deeply into my daughter's eyes, searching one last time for any remaining shred of a conscience, any tiny flicker of guilt for the horrific betrayal she was actively engineering against her own father. There was nothing. Her eyes were as cold and empty as a frozen lake. The structural engineer in my mind officially confirmed the absolute necessity of the impending demolition. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't leap from my seat. I didn't give them a single ounce of the explosive anger they so desperately craved. Instead, I slowly leaned back against the soft leather cushions, comfortably crossing one leg over the other. I looked back and forth between the two of them, meeting their intense, expectant glares with a serene, unshakable calmness. I let a gentle, warm smile slowly spread across my lined face. It was a smile of absolute, terrifying clarity. I spoke in a very soft, incredibly calm voice, a gentle frequency that even the hidden microphones must have struggled to capture. "You don't need to worry about the children," I said. The children are perfectly safe, and they are very far away from here. But the two of you look exceptionally exhausted. I paused for a heavy second, watching the first cracks of confusion appear on their arrogant, confident faces. Maintaining my perfect, warm smile, I said, "You two look exactly like you just endured a miserable flight back from Aspen." The heavy silence in the room instantly shattered. The color drained entirely from Derek's arrogant face. His fingers suddenly went completely weak, and the heavy leather briefcase slipped from his hand, crashing violently onto the hardwood floor. The heavy leather briefcase hit the polished hardwood floor with a deafening thud. The expensive metal latches popped open, spilling a cluster of glossy travel brochures and luxury ski resort receipts all across the floor. Derek stared down at the scattered papers, his jaw completely slack, his eyes darting frantically between the evidence on the ground and my calm expression. The carefully constructed illusion of the exhausted corporate executive evaporated instantly, replaced by the trembling terror of a man who realized he had just run straight into a brick wall. Natalie froze entirely. Her hands were still planted on her hips, but her confident posture had completely disintegrated. When she asked me what I was talking about, her voice was a tight whisper. She tried to force a dismissive laugh, an attempt to rebuild the lie, stammering that I was deeply confused, that they had just flown back from New York, and that my aging brain was clearly playing cruel tricks on me again. I didn't move an inch from the leather sofa. I gestured deliberately with my hand toward the scattered Aspen receipts on the floor. I told her she should have reminded her husband to empty his pockets before attempting to execute a masterclass in psychological manipulation. I told her I knew exactly where they had been. I knew about the private charter flight. I knew about the snowboards in the trunk. And most importantly, I knew about the hidden cameras recording every single second of our conversation. Before Natalie could construct another lie, a deep voice echoed out from the dark shadows of the adjacent kitchen. The voice calmly announced that Illinois law required two-party consent for audio recordings within a private residence, making her little surveillance network a felony invasion of privacy. Natalie and Derek flinched violently, spinning around to face the kitchen. From the darkness of the hallway, Jonathan Pierce stepped slowly into the bright light of the living room. Dressed in a perfectly tailored dark navy suit, he looked every bit the ruthless corporate litigator he was. He carried a heavy, dense leather briefcase in his right hand. There was absolutely no warmth or sympathy in his expression. He walked with a slow, deliberate confidence, stopping right beside the mahogany coffee table. He set his heavy briefcase down onto the wood with a solid, authoritative thud. Derek stumbled back a step, his eyes wide with genuine panic. He recognized Jonathan instantly. Any commercial real estate broker operating in Chicago knew exactly who Jonathan Pierce was, and they knew that if he was standing in your living room on a Sunday night, your career was effectively over. Jonathan didn't even look in Derek's direction. He locked his sharp gaze directly onto my daughter. He formally introduced himself as my legal counsel and calmly informed her that he had spent the entire afternoon reviewing her deeply flawed and highly illegal family court petition. The absolute shock of seeing a high-powered attorney inside her home finally broke through Natalie's frozen panic, igniting a wild, desperate fury. She realized instantly that her meticulously planned trap had not only failed, but had been completely inverted. Her face flushed a deep, angry red. Pointing a trembling finger at Jonathan, she screamed at him to get out of her house immediately. She yelled that he was trespassing and that she would have him disbarred for harassing her family. But Jonathan didn't even blink. He just stood there, a towering monument of legal ruin, waiting for her childish outburst to finish. When screaming at my lawyer didn't work, she turned her furious, frantic eyes back to me. The mask of the caring, concerned daughter was completely gone, replaced by a vicious, cornered animal. She shrieked at the top of her lungs, demanding to know where her children were. She accused me of kidnapping them. Reaching frantically into her designer purse, she yanked out her cell phone, holding it like a weapon. She yelled that I was a completely unhinged, violent old man who had finally lost his mind completely. She screamed that she was calling the police right now. She threatened to tell the emergency dispatcher that I was holding her children hostage, that I was a physical threat to society, and that this entire psychotic episode was the exact, hard evidence the family court judge needed to lock me away for the rest of my miserable life. She stabbed wildly at her phone screen, her thumb hovering over the emergency call button, her chest heaving with an aggressive, dramatic panic as she continued to shriek at me, desperately trying to manufacture the violent scene her hidden cameras originally needed. I remained perfectly still on the leather sofa. I didn't raise my voice to match her manic screaming. I didn't try to defend myself against her absurd, desperate accusations. Calmly reaching into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans, I pulled out my own cell phone. I looked directly into my daughter's wild, furious eyes. In a voice as cold and hard as structural steel, I told her she shouldn't bother calling the emergency dispatcher. I told her that she was absolutely right about one thing. The authorities definitely needed to see undeniable proof of exactly what kind of monsters were living inside this beautiful suburban home. Looking down at my glowing screen, I pressed a single pre-programmed button. I sent a blank text message signal to the specific number Jonathan had given me earlier that afternoon. I looked back up at Natalie. Placing my phone gently onto the coffee table, I told her that the police were already here. Less than 5 seconds later, the heavy brass handle of the front door turned with a sharp, mechanical click. The massive wood door was thrown open with force, slamming hard against the entryway wall with a loud bang. 2 federal agents, wearing dark windbreaker want breakers, along with a local uniformed police officer, stepped firmly into the well-lit foyer. The heavy thud of the federal agent's boots echoed sharply across the hardwood floor of the entryway. Natalie immediately pointed a trembling finger in my direction, her voice cracking with manufactured hysteria as she ordered the officers to arrest me for kidnapping her kids. She expected them to rush forward and tackle the crazy old man sitting on the sofa. Instead, the agents ignored her dramatics entirely. They didn't even glance in my direction. They walked right past her, their expressions grim and highly professional, locking their intense focus entirely onto her husband. The local police officer stepped calmly into position right in front of the heavy front door, effectively blocking the only exit out of the home. The sudden, terrifying shift in the atmosphere was palpable. This room was no longer a stage for my daughter's psychological manipulations. It had instantly transformed into a very real, very dangerous federal crime scene. Derek stumbled back another step, his spine hitting the cold drywall. He swallowed hard, wiping a fresh layer of cold sweat from his forehead. His eyes darted wildly around the room, desperately looking for an escape from a trap he hadn't even realized was set. Jonathan Pierce didn't waste a single second. Unlatching his heavy leather briefcase, he reached inside. He pulled out a thick stack of official banking documents. Slamming them onto the mahogany coffee table, with immense force, right over their scattered luxury vacation receipts. The sharp crack of the heavy paper hitting the wood made Derek jump physically. I watched his eyes lock onto the first page. It was the fraudulent home equity line of credit agreement. The exact same document bearing the perfect forgery of my signature that authorized the massive loan. But Jonathan wasn't finished. Reaching into his briefcase a second time, he pulled out a single sheet of heavily stamped paper, encased in a clear protective sleeve. He placed it gently onto the coffee table, right beside the fraudulent loan contract. This piece of paper was the ultimate key that locked them out. Smoothing the paper with his hand, he looked directly at Derek. He announced that this single sheet was a legally binding, state-certified revocation of power of attorney. He made sure to emphasize the official date printed clearly in red ink across the top. November 22nd, exactly 2 years ago. The blood left Derek's face entirely, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. Joining his hands in front of him, Jonathan began outlining the absolute destruction of their lives in a calm, methodical voice. He explained the law with the cold precision of a surgeon holding a scalpel. He told Derek that manipulating aging parents into surrendering their financial autonomy was certainly a morally bankrupt and despicable act. But in the eyes of a civil court, it could often be a lengthy, drawn-out battle. However, Jonathan continued, presenting a legally dead, completely revoked power of attorney to a federally insured national bank was a completely different story. He took a slow step closer to Derek, his imposing presence dominating the room. He pointed out that extracting $600,000 of pure home equity, illegally using that dead document, was not a family dispute. It constituted a severe, premeditated act of federal bank fraud. Jonathan gestured toward the federal agents standing quietly in the room. Because the target financial institution was federally insured, he explained, the crime immediately carried federal jurisdiction, bringing a mandatory, non-negotiable prison sentence of at least 10 full years behind bars. Jonathan didn't stop there. He wanted Derek to know that every dark corner of his criminal life had been thoroughly illuminated. Jonathan casually brought up the private corporate entity named Apex Holdings. I watched Derek's knees visibly buckle at the sound of his secret shell company's name. Jonathan calmly explained that the federal agents were already fully aware of the massive civil lawsuits currently pending against Derek's commercial real estate brokerage. He detailed exactly how the stolen $600,000 had been illegally wired directly into that hidden account in a desperate, last-minute attempt to appease the furious private investors whose money he had been actively embezzling for the past 4 years. Jonathan's voice dropped to a terrifyingly low, dangerous register as he delivered the final crushing blow. He told Derek that the authorities possessed the complete paper trail, the digital wire records, the forged appraisal reports, and the audio recordings from the hidden cameras, proving their malicious intent to silence me. The airtight trap they spent months building for me had been completely reversed, and Derek was now hopelessly caught fast in its steel jaws. The immense weight of the impending federal indictment crushed Derek instantly. He looked at the federal agents, his breathing rapid and shallow, completely broken by the terrifying reality of spending the next decade locked inside a federal prison cell. The arrogant, wealthy corporate broker vanished entirely, replaced by a pathetic, desperate coward who was willing to do absolutely anything to save his own skin. He was willing to sacrifice the mother of his children. He shrank back physically, stepping aggressively away from his wife as if she had suddenly become infected with a fatal disease. Raising his trembling hands in the self-defense, raising his trembling hands in the air in self-defense, he shook his head violently. He pointed his index finger directly into Natalie's face, his voice cracking with selfish panic. He screamed that he had absolutely nothing to do with the forged signature on the bank documents. He yelled that it was entirely her idea from the very beginning, that she was the one who physically's fraudulent bussy signed the fraudulent papers, and that it was her father's house. He looked desperately at the federal agents, begging them to believe that she had manipulated him into the entire scheme. Natalie froze completely, her eyes stretching wide with utter shock, letting out a loud, painful shriek of pure betrayal that echoed off the living room walls. The harsh shriek slowly degenerated into a pathetic, breathless sob. Natalie stared at her husband, her face twisted into a mask of absolute horror, as she realized that the man she had conspired with had not hesitated to sacrifice her at the very first opportunity. But the survival instinct of a cornered predator is a truly startling thing. Instead of collapsing into a puddle of defeated tears, she spun around violently and marched straight toward the two federal agents. She placed herself firmly between the police officers and her trembling husband, forcefully thrusting her manicured finger back in my direction. Her voice took on a manic, pleading pitch. She told the agents that they had to listen to her. She insisted that they were making a catastrophic mistake. She claimed that the entire situation was nothing more than a pathetic misunderstanding caused by a severely sick, delusional old man. She begged the officers to look at her family court filing, desperately trying to paint her malicious conservatorship plot as a protective medical shield. She told them that I had completely lost my mind, that I was suffering from late-stage dementia, and that my ruthless attorney was cruelly taking advantage of my rapidly declining mental state. She swore up and down that I was completely paranoid, that I had entirely fabricated the unbelievable story about a fake business trip, and that I had likely forged the complex bank documents myself during a sudden, uncontrollable episode of severe psychosis. I watched my own flesh and blood try to weaponize my sanity right in front of federal law enforcement. I didn't feel a single drop of anger. I felt only a deep, exhausting pity for the hollow shell of a human being she had become. I slowly stood up from the comfortable leather sofa. My movements were calm, deliberate, and absolutely steady. The federal agents immediately shifted their full attention to me, their hands resting cautiously near their heavy utility belts, waiting to see how the supposedly violent, highly unstable old man would react to such an aggressive, public accusation. I didn't shout. I didn't wave my arms in protest. I simply reached into the front pocket of my faded denim jeans and pulled out my phone. I explained calmly to the agents that my daughter and her husband had spent the entire week secretly installing hidden surveillance cameras throughout my private home. I told them they did this to capture a manufactured psychological breakdown because they desperately needed high-definition video evidence to secure an emergency conservatorship order on Monday morning. Tapping the illuminated screen, I opened the digital audio file I had extracted from Derek's computer, turning the speaker volume up to its absolute maximum. I handed the digital device directly to the lead federal agent. The crisp, unmistakable audio of Derek and Natalie discussing their treacherous Aspen vacation and their calculated conspiracy to dismantle my entire life filled the tense, quiet living room. The seasoned agents listened in absolute silence. As my daughter's voice came through the speaker, coldly mocking my deceased brother's funeral. They heard her proudly outline her master plan to use her own innocent children as emotional bait to push a grieving grandfather to the absolute edge of temporary insanity. As the damning recording played, the last remaining trace of healthy color drained entirely from Natalie's face. Her manic, desperate energy evaporated into thin air, completely paralyzed by the undeniable, horrific echo of her own malicious words. The lead agent slowly lowered my phone, his stern expression hardening into a look of absolute professional disgust. He looked directly at Natalie and told her that what he had heard was more than enough to establish criminal intent. Natalie slowly shifted her gaze toward me, genuine tears of absolute terror finally welling up in her eyes. Taking a small, hesitant step forward, she reached out her hand, softly calling out my name. She called me Dad, her voice breaking with the fragile innocence of a little girl desperately seeking the protection of her father's forgiveness. But she wasn't my little girl anymore. I looked her dead in the eye, my posture straight, my voice completely stripped of any remaining paternal warmth. I told her that when she was a child, I spent countless hours teaching her the basic, unbreakable rules of structural engineering. I reminded her of the absolute most important lesson I had ever taught her. If the foundation of a house cracks, I said, you don't simply paint over the ugly concrete to make it look pretty. You don't ignore the deep structural rot and blindly pray that the house miraculously stays standing. You dismantle it. You tear it all down, all the way to the dirt beneath, and you start over. I told her that she was the deep structural rotso threatening to bring our entire family down, and that I was finally dismantling it. The federal agents walked right past her, moving swiftly toward Derek. They ordered him to turn around and place his hands firmly behind his back. The sharp click of the heavy steel handcuffs locking around his wrists echoed through the quiet suburban house like the final, definitive strike of a judge's gavel. The local officer began reading Derek his constitutional rights, reciting the familiar legal language about the right to remain silent and the right to an attorney. Meanwhile, Jonathan Pierce stepped out from the dark shadows of the hallway. He walked straight toward Natalie, who was shaking uncontrollably as she watched her husband being restrained. Reaching into the breast pocket of his custom navy suit, Jonathan pulled out a thick, sealed, white envelope. He handed it to her, his expression completely unreadable and utterly professional. He calmly informed her that the envelope contained an official notice from Child Protective Services, issued in coordination with an emergency family court custody order. He told her that her children had been legally removed from her care and safely placed with Richard and Martha. Natalie took the thick white envelope from Jonathan with violently trembling hands. She tore open the paper seal, her eyes scanning the contents on the official Child Protective Services letterhead. I watched her breathing become incredibly shallow, her chest heaving as she absorbed the clinical, devastating words printed on the page. Jonathan stood before her, his voice like a relentless drumbeat of consequences. He informed her that a judge had officially granted emergency temporary custody of Leo and Mia to Richard and Martha, citing the toxic and criminally unstable environment she had intentionally manufactured in her own home. And almost as an afterthought, he added that the bank's fraud division had officially frozen every single financial asset bearing her name or her husband's. Joint checking accounts, offshore trusts, college savings plans. Absolutely, everything was blocked under a sweeping federal mandate pending a full criminal investigation. She was penniless, instantly stripped of the luxury lifestyle she had sacrificed her own father to maintain. At that exact moment, the lead federal agent gripped Derek's arm and guided him toward the open front door. Derek didn't even look back at his wife. He just kept his head low, shuffling out into the cool evening breeze toward the waiting patrol car, his expensive custom suit looking completely pathetic against the cold steel of the handcuffs. The local officer followed closely behind, closing the heavy wooden door with a loud final click that echoed through the foyer. Sss. The sound of the door closing seemed to snap whatever final thread was keeping Natalie upright. She looked around the spacious, beautifully decorated living room, suddenly realizing the absolute extent of her profound isolation. Her husband was gone, heading straight to a federal holding cell. Her precious children were miles away, safely removed from her toxic influence. Her bank accounts were completely frozen, leaving her without a single dime to her name. She had absolutely nothing left. The arrogant, wealthy, manipulative woman who had stood before me just 10 minutes ago completely shattered into a million jagged pieces. She broke down. Her knees hit the polished hardwood floor with a dull thud, her designer suit bunching up around her. She looked up at me from the floor, her face drenched in genuine, terror-filled tears. Crawling forward on her hands and knees, she reached out with desperately trembling fingers, trying to grab the hem of my faded jeans. Burying her face in her hands, she began to beg. Her voice was a broken, agonizing wail that tore through the quiet house. She pleaded for my forgiveness, her words pouring out in a frantic, incoherent stream of desperate apologies. She cried that she was so sorry, and that she had made a horrible, unforgivable mistake, lowest pits. But even at her absolute lowest point, she still couldn't take full responsibility for her malicious actions. Frantically, she began shifting the blame, pointing a shaking finger toward the closed front door, where Derek had just disappeared. She swore to me that it was all Derek's idea. She claimed that he had ruthlessly pressured her, that he had manipulated her into the cruel conservatorship plot, because he was utterly terrified of going to federal prison. Sobbing, she said, she was just a helpless, frightened wife trying to protect her family from his disastrous financial mistakes, begging me to remember the sweet little girl I had raised. As I looked down at my weeping daughter, clutching at my legs and begging for mercy, a deep, agonizing wave of parental sorrow physically squeezed my heart. For a fleeting second, I didn't see the treacherous woman who had tried to lock me away in a psychiatric ward. I saw the little girl in blue overalls who used to follow me around a greasy garage, handing me heavy metal tools while I fixed the family car. I saw the teenager whose hand I proudly held as I walked her down the aisle, the daughter I had spent over 40 years protecting with every ounce of my strength. My rough, calloused hand twitched instinctively, wanting nothing more than to reach down, stroke her hair, and tell her that everything was going to be all right, just like I had done 1,000 times before. But the dark shadows shifted in the empty living room, and the cold reality of the day rushed back with unforgiving clarity. I remembered sitting alone in this silent house at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. I remembered the heavy, crushing weight of missing my brother's funeral. I pictured Bill's wooden casket being lowered into the cold earth without me there to offer a decent, honorable goodbye. I remembered the tiny, unblinking red light of the hidden surveillance camera staring at me from the plastic smoke detector, patiently waiting for me to lose my temper so she could steal my absolute freedom. That brief spark of warm, paternal sympathy was instantly extinguished, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of structural steel. I slowly and deliberately took a step back, forcing her desperate, trembling hands to slip off the denim fabric of my jeans. I looked down at her tear-stained face one last time, my expression completely devoid of any remaining emotion. I told her that Derek may have supplied the hidden cameras and the forged bank papers, but she was the one who gladly handed him the heavy hammer to smash my life to pieces. I told her that a true victim of manipulation doesn't eagerly use her own innocent children as emotional bait to dismantle her grieving father. I told her that the moment she decided my freedom and dignity were worth less than her luxury ski vacations and imported leather couches, she had made her final choice. Turning my back on her, I walked slowly toward the front foyer. Jonathan Pierce followed closely behind in silence, his heavy leather briefcase gripped firmly in his right hand. I reached out and grabbed the cold brass knob of the heavy wooden front door. Behind me, Natalie let out a raw, deafening shriek of pure terror. She screamed my name over and over again, begging me not to leave her alone in the dark, pleading for a second chance she absolutely did not deserve. I pushed the door open and stepped out into the crisp, clean evening air. I walked down the long, winding concrete driveway, never looking back a single time, leaving my daughter hysterically sobbing inside the empty, camera-filled house she had built to be my permanent prison. The crisp evening air filled my lungs as I left that massive suburban home behind. I walked to the end of the long block, where my reliable old truck sat parked under the dim halo of a street lamp. Climbing inside, I gripped the worn leather steering wheel and let out a long, shaky breath. The deafening cries of my daughter had faded into the quiet hum of the engine, but the absolute finality of what I had just done settled deep into my bones. Fast forward an entire month later, the wheels of justice usually turn incredibly slow. But when you hand prosecutors a perfectly wrapped gift containing high-definition audio confessions, forged bank documents, and a clear paper trail of stolen funds, those wheels spin with terrifying speed. Jonathan Pierce called me almost every single day, detailing the massive legal fallout. The criminal case against my son-in-law moved incredibly fast. Derek sat in a cold holding cell for 3 days, before his arrogant bravado shattered completely. Faced with a mountain of irrefutable evidence and the terrifying prospect of a lengthy trial that would expose his corporate embezzlement, his expensive defense attorneys advised him to surrender. Derek accepted a strict plea deal to avoid the maximum penalty. He pleaded guilty to multiple felony charges, including federal bank fraud and corporate embezzlement. The judge showed him absolutely no mercy. Derek was formally sentenced to 8 years in a federal prison, stripped permanently of his real estate license, and ordered to pay millions of dollars in mandatory restitution to the investors he defrauded. He traded his custom Italian suits for a standard-issue prison jumpsuit, locked away in a world where his superficial charm meant absolutely nothing. As for Natalie, the consequences of her profound betrayal dismantled every single aspect of her carefully constructed reality. Because she had willingly participated in the fraudulent home equity loan, federal authorities and the national bank came down on her with absolute ruthlessness. To avoid serving federal prison time alongside her husband, she was forced to cooperate fully with fraud investigators. The bank demanded immediate repayment of the stolen 600,000 lifestars. Without Derek's illegal income to support her lavish lifestyle, She had no choice but to liquidate her assets immediately. She was forced to sell her beautiful, massive suburban home at a massive financial loss, solely to satisfy the aggressive bank liens and mounting legal fees. The luxury cars, the expensive jewelry, the imported leather furniture. Absolutely everything was repossessed or sold off at public auction. My daughter now lives in a cramped, poorly lit one-bedroom apartment on the industrial edge of the city. She works long, exhausting hours as a low-level administrative assistant, barely making enough to cover her basic monthly rent. But the loss of her superficial wealth was nothing compared to the devastating loss of her family. The family court judge reviewed the harrowing reports provided by Child Protective Services and the horrific audio recording of her planning to intentionally traumatize me while I was mourning my brother. The court ruled that Natalie posed a severe emotional danger to her children. Richard and Martha were formally granted full physical custody of little Leo and Mia. Natalie was stripped of her parental rights and downgraded to a strictly limited visitation schedule. She is now permitted only 2 hours of supervised visitation every other week. She has to sit in a sterile, brightly lit room at a state facility under the constant gaze of a court-appointed social worker, desperately trying to explain to her young, confused children why they can't live with mommy anymore. She had built a digital trap to steal my freedom. And in the end, she built a permanent prison of isolation for herself. While Natalie's world collapsed into absolute ruin, Jonathan Pierce worked tirelessly to repair the severe damage done to my own foundation. Armed with the legally certified revocation of power of attorney, Jonathan systematically dismantled the fraudulent bank loan. The National Bank formally acknowledged the gross negligence committed by their loan officer and that corrupt notary. The massive $600,000 debt was completely and permanently erased from my financial record. The heavy lien was officially removed, and the title to my historic Craftsman home was cleared entirely, restoring my property to the safe, unburdened haven it was always meant to be. The malicious family court petition was the next flimsy pillar to easily collapse. Jonathan filed an immediate motion to dismiss, presenting the audio evidence of their calculated extortion plot. The presiding judge was absolutely furious upon learning the truth. The judge threw the entire custody case out of court with extreme prejudice, ensuring that Natalie could never bring such baseless vindictive claims against me in the state of Illinois ever again. But Jonathan and I didn't stop there. We turned our sharp focus toward the shady private doctor who had so willingly fabricated my medical evaluation. A physician who sells false diagnoses to help greedy relatives steal from the elderly is a dangerous threat. Jonathan submitted the doctor's fraudulent paperwork, along with the pristine medical files, from my actual primary physician, directly to the state medical board. A swift, aggressive investigation was launched immediately. When investigators raided his private clinic, they uncovered a horrifying history of similar fraudulent behavior. The doctor had his medical license permanently revoked, in absolute disgrace. He now faces severe criminal charges for medical fraud and conspiracy. The toxic rot that threatened to destroy my life was meticulously identified, cut out, and entirely demolished. I was finally standing on solid ground again, breathing the fresh air of freedom in the quiet comfort of my own home, completely prepared to rebuild my future. A crisp autumn breeze rustles through the freshly cut grass of my backyard, carrying the melodic sound of children's laughter. I stand on the wooden deck of my Craftsman home, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee, walking down the short flight of stairs. I hand one of the mugs to Richard, who is sitting comfortably beside his wife, Martha, on a sturdy cedar bench I built with my own hands years ago. It's a beautiful Saturday afternoon. The kind of day that makes you appreciate the simple, quiet rhythms of a peaceful life. We sit together in a comfortable, friendly silence, watching little Leo and Mia chase a bright yellow soccer ball across the wide yard. The kids are thriving, full of pure, unburdened joy, completely from the devastating adult storm that had violently upended their young lives just months earlier. Looking at Richard and Martha, sitting in my garden, I realized that my understanding of the true meaning of family has undergone a profound shift. We are three aging parents who have all suffered the ultimate heartbreak of watching our own flesh and blood succumb to the worst kind of greed and moral corruption. But rather than letting that shared tragedy pull us apart or sink us into bitter, lonely despair, it has forged a deep, unbreakable bond between us instead. We have become a new, highly unconventional family, carefully built from the broken pieces left behind by our toxic children. Our foundation is no longer built on blind blood loyalty, but on absolute, unwavering honesty and a fierce, shared devotion to protecting the innocent lives playing right in front of us. Martha takes a slow sip of her hot coffee and smiles brightly as little Mia successfully kicks the ball past her brother's defense, raising her tiny arms in victory. Reaching over, Martha gives my arm a gentle, reassuring pat, her eyes shining with a deep, unspoken gratitude for the sanctuary we have worked together to create. I smile back, feeling a profound sense of true peace settle deep into my tired bones and my chest. But as an experienced structural engineer, I know that peace is never something you can simply assume will last forever without proper support. Peace is a fragile structure that must be actively maintained, heavily reinforced, and legally protected against all future storms. And that is exactly why, earlier that same week, I sat in Jonathan Pierce's polished downtown office for one final, crucial meeting. We weren't there to dismantle fraudulent bank loans or file defensive legal injunctions. We were there to meticulously construct a permanent, indestructible financial fortress. I instructed Jonathan to place my entire life savings, my remaining retirement accounts, and the full legal deed to my beloved craftsman home directly into a highly restrictive, legally binding, irrevocable trust. An irrevocable trust is a very specific, incredibly powerful legal tool. Once those heavy documents are officially signed, notarized, and fully executed, the complex terms cannot be modified, amended, or revoked by anyone. Not even by me. It effectively strips me of personal direct ownership of the physical assets, moving them entirely under the protective, independent control of the trust itself, managed strictly by a neutral, court-appointed trustee. I established this massive financial shield for one unwavering purpose. I wanted to guarantee, beyond any shadow of a legal doubt, that the legacy I spent 40 years fighting to build with these calloused hands will go directly to Leo and Mia, delivered straight into their hands the moment they reach adulthood. Jonathan drafted the complex legal paperwork with the exact same rigorous, aggressive precision he used to dismantle Derek in federal court. We inserted layers upon layers of ironclad provisions and strict exclusion clauses into the dense contract. I made absolutely certain that Natalie's full legal name was explicitly written into the disinheritance paperwork. The legal language we used was incredibly cold, highly precise, and legally devastating. It explicitly dictates that my estranged daughter is permanently barred from ever inheriting a single penny of my accumulated wealth. She is never to be granted any form of administrative access to the protected accounts, and she is strictly prohibited from ever contesting the trust in a civil court of law. Even if she miraculously manages to manipulate a sympathetic judge or manufacture another elaborate, deceptive narrative in the distant future, the rigid legal architecture of the irrevocable trust will stand as a massive, solid concrete wall, completely blocking her from any financial gain. I have permanently and purposefully cut away the safety net she so arrogantly tried to steal from me. She will have to survive the rest of her days, entirely on her own exhausted efforts, locked out forever from the wealth she tried to force open with cruel deception. As I sit on the wooden bench, watching my grandchildren laugh under the warm autumn sun, I know that my construction work is finally finished. I have successfully dismantled the rotted, failing pillars of my past, and in their place, I have poured a brand new, flawless concrete foundation that will easily support the bright, innocent future of the two young children I love more than life itself. This new family we have built is no longer defined by bloodline, but by truth, respect, and a shared commitment to always protect one another in the dark storms. I look down at the rough calluses on my hands. They are the scars of a long, demanding life. But for the first time in my entire existence, I truly feel like I have built something that will stand the test of time. I take a deep, steady breath of the crisp autumn air, knowing that they are finally safe, and that they will remain safe for the long, beautiful life ahead of them. A few days after my meeting with Jonathan, I woke up early in the morning, before the sun had even fully climbed above the horizon. The entire neighborhood was completely silent, draped in a thick blanket of cool autumn fog that clung tightly to the damp grass. So, slipping into my warmest flannel shirt and a heavy denim jacket, I felt an incredibly deep need to fulfill the promise I had made weeks ago in that empty living room. I walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and pulled out a single glass bottle of dark, rich, stout beer. It was Bill's absolute favorite brand, the exact same kind we used to share on my back porch after a long, grueling week of pouring concrete and bending rebar. Placing the cold bottle carefully on the passenger seat of my truck, I drove through the quiet city streets, heading slowly toward the local cemetery. The drive was peaceful, giving me plenty of time to reflect on the incredible turbulence of the past month. I drove through the tall iron gates of the cemetery just as the morning sun began to pierce through the heavy fog, casting long golden rays across the manicured green lawns and the neat rows of polished granite headstones. Parking my truck along the narrow gravel path, I grabbed the cold bottle of beer and walked slowly up the gentle slope toward the newer section of the cemetery. The morning dew soaked through the leather of my boots as I navigated the quiet grounds. Finally, I arrived at his resting place. The headstone was simple, elegant, and perfectly cut, exactly the way Bill would have wanted it. I stood there for a long time, simply reading his name and the dates of his birth and passing carved deeply into the smooth gray stone. The reality of his physical absence hit me with a fresh wave of sorrow. But it wasn't the desperate, agonizing grief that had paralyzed me on the day of his funeral. This was a quiet, respectful sorrow, the kind that honors a life well lived. Slowly kneeling down on the damp grass, I felt the cold moisture seep through the knees of my faded jeans. I reached out, tracing the carved letters of his name with my calloused fingers. I smiled gently, remembering his loud, booming laugh, and the heavy, rhythmic thud his wooden cane used to make on my hardwood floors. I twisted the metal cap off the glass bottle of stout. Holding the bottle out over the fresh soil, I tilted it slowly forward. The dark, rich liquid poured out, soaking deeply into the black earth. I watched the foam settle into the grass, feeling a powerful sense of connection to my brother. Taking a deep breath, letting the crisp morning air fill my tired lungs, I finally began to speak. I told him everything. My voice was low and steady, echoing softly in the quiet, misty air of the vast cemetery grounds. "I brought you your favorite, Bill," I said. I am so incredibly sorry I couldn't be here on the day they laid you to rest. I know you would understand, but I still needed to come here and tell you face to face. I need you to know that the little brother you saved all those years ago finally learned how to stand up and protect himself." I sat cross-legged on the wet grass, completely ignoring the cold. I explained the horrific details of the trap Natalie and Derek had set for me. I told him about the hidden cameras, the fraudulent bank loan, and the terrifying family court petition designed to lock me away in a dark psychiatric ward. I told him how my heart had shattered into a million pieces when I realized my own daughter had orchestrated my absolute ruin. "But then," I said, "I found strength in your memory. As I sat alone in that dark house, waiting for them to spring their trap, I remembered the sheer courage you showed back in 1985 when you ran toward that falling steel beam." A profound realization washed over me like a wave of warm, absolute clarity. "You didn't hesitate back then, Bill," I continued. "You saw a catastrophic disaster coming straight for me, and you threw your own body into the wreckage to push me out of harm's way. You shattered your own legs so that I could walk away, completely untouched. For decades, I thought your sacrifice was simply about keeping me alive. I thought it was just about surviving that single, horrific construction accident. But sitting in that empty living room, surrounded by hidden microphones and treacherous lies, I finally understood the true weight of what you did." I looked directly at the letters carved into the cold granite, my eyes filling with warm tears of immense gratitude. "You didn't just save my life in 1985, brother," I said. "You gave me the absolute strength and the heavy responsibility to save the rest of my life right now. If I had let my daughter ruin me, if I had simply surrendered to her cruel manipulations and allowed her to lock me away, I would have been throwing away the miraculous second chance you suffered so terribly to give me. I realized that the way to honor your ultimate sacrifice was to absolutely refuse to let my life be demolished by toxic, greedy people." The tears fell silently down my weathered cheeks, but they were tears of profound serenity. "You saved me twice, brother," I whispered. "Your beautiful memory saved my soul from being crushed." I placed my rough hand, flat, against the cold granite of the headstone, whispering a final, heartfelt thank you. To the silent stone, I stood up and walked away, stepping out into the bright, warming sunlight, completely ready to truly live the life that had been saved. A massive weight lifted permanently from my shoulders as I walked through those iron gates and back into the regular rhythm of the world. It has been a month since that morning at the cemetery, and my life has settled into a beautiful, quiet routine. I spend my days in my woodworking shop, teaching my grandson Leo how to properly measure and cut timber, and watching my granddaughter Mia paint the birdhouses we build together. Richard and Martha come over every single Sunday for dinner. We don't talk about Derek sitting in a federal prison cell. We don't talk about the cramped apartment where my daughter now lives alone. Suil, we talk about the future. We talk about the kids, we laugh, and our laughter fills the spaces that used to be suffocating with deception. But I know that many of you listening to my story today might be sitting in the exact same dark corner I was in just weeks ago. You might be looking across the dinner table at a family member who uses your love for them as a weapon. There is a very dangerous lie forced upon us by society, particularly upon parents. From the moment we hold our children in our arms, we are told that family is absolutely everything, that blood is thicker than water, and that we must forgive our relatives no matter how terribly they treat us. We are brainwashed into believing that cutting ties with a family member is a selfish act. But let me tell you something I learned the hard, brutal way. Sometimes, the very blood that is supposed to bind you together is the exact same water that is slowly drowning you. Abuse should never be tolerated simply because it comes from someone who shares your last name. Disrespect doesn't suddenly become acceptable just because the person tearing you down is the same person you once taught how to walk. I spent 40 years of my life believing that my ultimate responsibility as a father was to provide an unbreakable safety net for my daughter. I thought that if I just gave her enough love, loved her hard enough, and forgave her enough, she would eventually learn to appreciate the foundation I built for her. I was completely wrong. When you give everything to a person who lacks a moral compass, they don't become grateful. They become entitled. They begin to view your generosity as a weakness, and they start looking to bleed you dry of every final ounce of value before you're gone. My daughter didn't just want my money. She wanted my absolute surrender. She wanted to erase my dignity, lock me in a sterile hospital ward, and steal the legacy I broke my back to build. The hardest thing a parent can ever do is look at their own child and realize they have raised a predator. It goes against absolutely every biological instinct we possess. Your heart screams at you to protect them, to cover up their mistakes, and to take all the blame upon yourself. But you cannot protect someone by shielding them from the consequences of their own malicious behavior. You only end up becoming their ultimate victim. As a structural engineer, I've spent my entire career looking at blueprints. I know that every single building, no matter how tall or grand, relies entirely on the strength of its foundation. If the concrete wasn't poured correctly, if the rebar has completely rusted through, the building will inevitably collapse. You cannot save a structure destined to fall by simply hanging new curtains or painting the walls a brighter color. You have to be brave enough to swing the demolition wrecking ball. You have to be strong enough to tear it all the way down to the dirt, clear away the toxic rubble, and start completely from scratch. That is exactly what I did to my own family. I demolished the toxic structure my daughter built, and I poured a brand new foundation for my grandchildren. It was the most painful decision of my life, but it was also the most necessary. I am sharing my story with you today because I know there are so many good, hard-working people out there who are secretly being crushed under the immense weight of their own toxic families. You might be listening to this story right now while hiding in your bedroom or sitting in your car, wondering how much longer you can endure the manipulation and the constant disrespect. I am here to tell you that you absolutely have the right to walk away. You have the right to protect your peace, your finances, and your mental health, even if it means walking away from your own flesh and blood. You do not owe your life to people who are actively trying to destroy it. Some people will say, I went too far by letting my daughter lose everything. They will say, a father should never turn his back on his child, no matter how horrific her crimes. But respect is not inherited. It is earned, and abuse should never be tolerated because of a blood relation. I removed the safety net she was using to strangle me, and I left her to face the real world completely on her own. Did I do the right thing, or was I too harsh? Let me know in the comments below. I always read through every single comment, and I truly value your honest opinions. And please, let me know what city you are watching from today. It brings me so much joy to know how far these stories travel. If you found value in my journey, and if my story gave you the courage to stand up and protect yourself, please don't forget to subscribe and leave a super thanks. Always protect your foundation. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story. Goodbye for now, my dear friends. And remember to stay incredibly strong out there in this wide world today.